Nobody paid attention to the boy dragging plastic barrels across the yard behind Miller's Hollow. Not at first. Wyatt Teller was 12 years old, and by late April he had collected 9 of them, old feed barrels, a cracked stock tank, even a rusted bathtub someone had left by the county dump. He hauled them one by one behind his father's equipment shed, out of sight from the road, and lined them up beneath the barn's gutter line like soldiers waiting for orders. He didn't explain why. He just kept hauling. His mother asked him twice what he was doing with all that junk. He told her he was working on something. She let it go, the way she let most of his projects go, because Wyatt had never once broken anything by trying. If quiet ingenuity and stories of families holding on to the land mean something to you, hit subscribe and join us. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, we read every single one. Miller's Hollow sat in the eastern folds of Franklin County, Tennessee, where the ridgelines pressed close together and the creeks ran fast after rain and dry as bone by July. The soil there was a mix of red clay and river loam, good ground when it had water, stubborn ground when it didn't. The hollow itself was narrow, maybe 2 miles end to end, cupped between wooded ridges that kept the wind out in winter and the heat in during summer. Fog gathered in the low places most mornings and burned off slow, curling up through the tree lean like something reluctant to leave. The Tellers had worked 60 acres in that hollow for 3 generations, mostly cattle, a little corn, and a hillside orchard that had been in the family since Wyatt's great-grandfather planted it by hand in the years after the war. The old man, Silas Teller, had come home from overseas with nothing but a duffel bag and a stubborn idea that the ground could be made to give back more than it took, if a man was patient enough with it. He'd planted the first dozen trees himself, using a shovel he'd carried 3,000 miles, and by the time he died in 1981 the orchard had grown to nearly 4 acres of apple, peach, and pear trees that fed half the hollow every autumn. His father, Roy Teller, was a steady man who didn't waste words or diesel. He'd inherited the farm at 26 when his own father passed, and he'd spent the better part of 2 decades since then keeping it exactly as it had always been, not because he lacked ambition, but because he understood something about land that took most men a lifetime to learn. It didn't reward hurry. Roy was the kind of man who checked the same fence line every week whether it needed checking or not, who fixed a squeaking gate hinge the same afternoon he noticed it, who believed a farm ran on attention more than money, though it certainly needed both. His mother, Carol, ran the farm's books and kept chickens that laid better than anyone else's in the hollow. She had a way of noticing small things before they became large ones. A hinge that squeaked wrong, a child who'd gone too quiet, a column of numbers that didn't add up the way they should. She'd married into farming from a town family over in Winchester and had taken to it the way some people take to a language they were always meant to speak. She kept a garden behind the house that produced more tomatoes and squash than the family could reasonably eat, and she sold the surplus at the same Saturday market where Wyatt sold his eggs. Wyatt had one older sister, Josephine, 17 and mostly uninterested in anything that happened outside her phone or her plans for community college in the fall. She wasn't unkind about it, just distracted in the particular way teenagers are distracted, already halfway gone from the place she'd grown up in, her mind occupied with dorm applications and a boyfriend 2 towns over who worked at his family's tire shop. And he had one younger brother, Denny, 9 years old, who followed Wyatt everywhere like a shadow with muddy boots, asking questions Wyatt didn't always have patience for but usually answered anyway, because he remembered what it was like to be 9 and desperate to understand everything. It was Wyatt's grandfather, Ellis, who noticed things first. Ellis was 79, lived in a converted tack room off the barn, and spent most mornings listening to an old weather radio and writing rainfall totals into a spiral notebook he'd kept since 1974. 50 years of numbers, page after page, dates and inches and notes in cramped handwriting about which fields flooded and which ones cracked, which years the corn came in tall and which years it barely reached a man's knee. He didn't talk much, but when he did, people listened, because Ellis Teller had lived through 6 droughts and remembered every one of them by name, the way other men remembered football seasons, the drought of '54, the drought of '77, the bad one in '88 that had nearly cost his own father the farm. Ellis had been the one who taught Wyatt to read the sky the way some men read a newspaper. He'd taught him what it meant when the cattle bunched up under the trees before a storm, what it meant when the leaves on the sycamores turned pale side up in a certain kind of wind, what it meant when the creek smelled a particular way 3 days before rain finally came. Wyatt had been a quiet study, the kind of student who didn't ask many questions out loud but remembered everything he was told. The trouble started the spring Franklin County fell into its second dry year running. The first dry year had been manageable, tight, but manageable, the kind of season that made a farmer grumble and tighten his belt without truly worrying. The second one arrived on the heels of a winter with almost no snowpack, and by March the topsoil in the upper fields had already begun to lighten in color, the way ground does when it's been asking for water longer than anyone's been willing to admit. Roy walked those fields every morning before breakfast, crouching every 100 yards or so to crumble a handful of dirt between his fingers, watching it fall apart into powder instead of holding together the way healthy soil should. The orchard on the hill was struggling worst of all. It sat higher than the rest of the farm, on a slope that drained fast and held moisture poorly, and the well that fed its irrigation line was drawing slower every week. The pump groaned longer each morning before water finally reached the surface, and by April it was taking nearly twice as long to fill a stock tank as it had the previous spring. Roy had started rationing water to the young trees just to keep the older, more established ones alive, walking the rows each evening with a bucket, measuring out just enough to keep the roots from giving up entirely. It was slow, deliberate work, and Wyatt often walked with him in the evenings, watching his father's careful movements, the way he checked each tree's leaves before deciding how much water it needed. He'd called out the county extension agent, a soft-spoken woman named Denise Coyle, who'd worked with the Tellers before and knew the land almost as well as they did. She'd been coming out to Franklin County farms for nearly 15 years, and there wasn't much about the local soil and weather patterns she hadn't seen at least once. She walked the orchard twice, crouching to check the soil at different depths, running her fingers through dust that should have been dirt, and gave him the only advice she had. "You've got 2 options, Roy. Drill deeper, go down another 40, 50 feet, see if you hit a stronger vein. Or you truck water in from the co-op until the weather turns. I wish I had something better for you." Both cost money the Tellers didn't have lying around, not with cattle prices soft and the corn crop already stretched thin from the previous year's shortfall. Roy thanked her anyway, the way he thanked people even when the news wasn't what he wanted, and walked her back toward her truck, the two of them talking quietly about the odds of a wet summer turning things around. Wyatt listened to the whole conversation from the porch steps, chin resting on his knees, and afterward he asked Denise a question that made her pause halfway into her truck. "How much rain actually falls on this place in a year?" Denise blinked, surprised, and turned back toward him. "More than you'd think, actually. Even in a dry year, Franklin County usually gets somewhere around 45 inches. Then where does it go?" She didn't have a clean answer, not really. "It ran off the barn roof, off the house roof, down the gravel driveway, into the roadside ditch, and out to the creek, gone within an afternoon, same as it always had, same as it had for every farm in the hollow since anyone could remember." Nobody had ever thought to ask where all that water went, because it had simply never occurred to anyone that it might matter. Denise admitted as much, almost apologetically, before climbing into her truck and driving off down the gravel road. That conversation happened in March. By April, Wyatt was collecting barrels. Here's what Wyatt had figured out, and what none of the grown adults in Miller's Hollow had bothered to calculate. A single 1-inch rainfall, falling across the roof of a standard barn, shed somewhere around 600 gallons of water. The Teller barn roof was large, nearly 1,400 square feet. Which meant even a modest storm could produce more usable water in one afternoon than the orchard struggling well pumped in an entire week. Wyatt had learned the figure from his grandfather's old rainfall notebook, cross-referenced against a rainwater harvesting guide he'd found tucked inside a stack of extension pamphlets in the tack room, the paper gone soft and yellow with age, the ink faded but still legible. He'd read the pamphlet 3 times over, working through the calculations slowly with a pencil and a torn scrap of notebook paper, checking his math against Ellis's rainfall records until the numbers held steady no matter how he ran them. The math wasn't complicated, not once he understood it. The problem was that nobody had ever bothered to catch the water in the first place. It had always simply run off, unclaimed, into the same ditch it had run into for 100 years. He spent the better part of 2 weeks gathering materials before he dug a single trench. The barrels came from neighbors mostly, old feed containers nobody wanted, a cracked stock tank Dewey Hargrove had been meaning to haul to the scrapyard, a bathtub from the county dump that Wyatt cleaned out himself with a wire brush and an afternoon of patience, scrubbing away years of rust and grime until the metal underneath showed through pale and usable. He paid for the connecting hose and fittings with money he'd saved from selling eggs at the Saturday farmer's market, $40 he'd been putting toward a bicycle before the idea took hold of him instead. He didn't regret the trade, not even for a moment, though Denny asked him twice if he was sure about giving up the bike money. "I'll get the bike later," Wyatt told him. "This is more important right now." What he built that spring was crude. Mismatched barrels connected with scavenged garden hose, a section of gutter downspout he'd rerouted himself with tin snips borrowed from his father's workshop, and a hand pump salvaged from an old well casing behind the shed. He dug a shallow collection trench by hand after school each day, guiding overflow from the barrels toward a cistern he'd built from the cracked stock tank, sealed along every seam with roofing tar he'd bought with the last of his egg money. The work left his palms blistered and his fingernails packed with dirt that took days to scrub clean. Josephine walked past once, saw him elbow deep in mud, and asked if he'd lost his mind. He told her it was going to work. She raised an eyebrow, unconvinced, and went back inside without another word. Not cruel, just 17, and already dreaming of a life somewhere that wasn't Miller's Hollow, somewhere with paved roads and a mall and none of the particular smell of a barn on a hot afternoon. The first storm came in early May, a real one, thunder rolling through the hollow for most of an evening, lightning flickering behind the ridgeline like something breathing. It should have worked. It didn't. The barrels filled fast, the sound of rain drumming against their plastic sides loud enough to hear from the porch, but the connecting hoses kinked and burst at 2 joints under the pressure, and half the water Wyatt had hoped to save simply poured out onto the ground and soaked away same as always, wasted same as always. He stood at the window watching it happen, feeling something sink in his chest that he didn't have a word for yet. He went out in the rain that night, despite his mother calling after him to wait until morning, and stood watching the failure unfold, soaked through within minutes, saying nothing. There was something he needed to see with his own eyes, some part of the failure he couldn't fully understand from a dry porch. In the morning, he rebuilt the joints with rigid PVC instead of hose, angling each connection so gravity carried water steadily downhill from barrel to barrel without relying on flexible fittings that could twist and fail under pressure. It took him most of a Saturday, working alone in the equipment shed with his father's tools spread across the workbench, measuring twice before every cut the way Roy had taught him. The second storm, 10 days later, filled the system almost to capacity. Until the cistern's tar seal failed overnight, cracking along a seam he hadn't reinforced properly, and he woke to find nearly 200 gallons gone, leached silently back into the dirt while he slept. He'd checked the system before bed and everything had looked fine. By morning, a dark stain spread across the ground around the stock tank, and the water level inside had dropped by more than half. Denny found him kneeling by the empty cistern the next morning before school, quiet, jaw tight, already mixing a fresh batch of sealant with hands that had gone raw from the work. Denny didn't say anything at first, just crouched down beside his brother and handed him tools without being asked, the way he'd learned to do over the past several weeks. His grandfather Ellis came out with his coffee, looked at the mess, and said only one thing, the way he said most things, without wasted words. Seal it twice. Let it cure a full week this time. Water doesn't forgive shortcuts. Wyatt did exactly that. He resealed the cistern along every seam, twice, working the tar deep into every crack with a brush he'd borrowed from his mother's old painting supplies. And he forced himself to wait the full 7 days without testing it, even though the waiting nearly killed him, even though he found himself walking out to check the tank 3 or 4 times a day just to look at it, resisting the urge to fill it early. He reinforced every downspout joint with metal clamps instead of hose ties, tightened everything twice, and checked the whole system each evening after chores whether it needed it or not, running his hands along every seam like a man checking fence wire. By the third storm, in late May, the system held. Every joint, every seam, every connection did exactly what it was supposed to do. Wyatt stood in the rain that evening watching water flow smoothly from the roof, through the pipes, into the cistern, filling steadily without a single leak, and felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight for weeks. Old Dewey Hargrove, who farmed the ridge above the Tellers, had driven by twice that spring and laughed both times. Boys collecting rainwater in a bathtub, he told the men at the feed store, shaking his head over his coffee. Lord, what'll these kids think of next? Nobody argued with him. It did look foolish, barrels and hose and a cracked stock tank behind a shed, guarded by a boy who wouldn't explain himself to anyone who asked. Even some of the Teller's own relatives, an aunt who visited from Chattanooga in June, had raised an eyebrow at the sight of it and asked Carol, half joking, if the boy needed something to do. By June, the orchard well had dropped low enough that Roy was seriously weighing the cost of drilling deeper, running numbers at the kitchen table late into the evening with Carol, the two of them quiet and worried in the way people get when a decision is expensive either way. Wyatt overheard parts of those conversations from his bedroom above the kitchen, the low murmur of his parents' voices carrying up through the floorboards, numbers mentioned that sounded enormous to a 12-year-old. Thousands of dollars for a deeper well, thousands more if that well came up dry too. That was the week the rain stopped almost entirely for 18 straight days, the sky staying a hard, cloudless blue that would have been beautiful under any other circumstances. The creek narrowed to a thin ribbon of water threading between exposed rocks. The pastures browned at the edges first, then further in. Even Ellis's rainfall notebook, when Wyatt checked it, showed nothing but zeros for over 2 weeks running. Wyatt's system, quietly, without ceremony, kept the young trees alive. Every evening after chores he hand-carried buckets from the cistern up the hill, watering the roots directly instead of running the strained well line at all. It was slow work, up and down the slope again and again until his shoulders ached and his shirt stuck to his back with sweat, but the trees held their color while the ground around them turned the color of old bone. Denny helped when he could, carrying a smaller bucket that sloshed more than it delivered, but Wyatt never turned him away. Roy noticed the well pressure holding steadier than he'd expected and asked his son about it one evening, standing near the fence where the creek ran low and slow, the shovel he'd been using still in his hand. How much water you got stored up there? About 1,100 gallons, if it's full, Wyatt said. More if it rains again soon. His father didn't say much else that day. He just stood there for a long moment, looking at his son the way a man looks at something he's underestimated. But the following weekend, without being asked, he helped Wyatt run a second downspout off the equipment shed roof, the two of them working together in comfortable silence, passing tools back and forth like they'd done this 100 times before. It was the first time all spring Wyatt had felt his father truly looking at the project instead of past it. Dewey Hargrove stopped laughing in July, when his own creek-fed pond dropped so low his cattle had to be moved to a neighbor's pasture for water. He drove past the Teller place on his way to haul emergency water from the co-op and saw the orchard still green on the hillside while everything around it, including his own bottomland, had gone the color of straw. He sat in his truck at the end of the driveway for a long minute before finally pulling in, engine idling, staring at the green hillside like he was trying to convince himself it was real. He found Wyatt checking the cistern gauge and asked him flat out, no joke in his voice this time, how he'd done it. Wyatt walked him through the whole thing, the roof math, the gravity flow, the barrels, the seal Ellis had taught him to trust, the 2 failures before the system finally held. He showed him the notebook, the pamphlet, the careful measurements he'd worked out with a pencil months earlier. Dewey listened the whole way through without interrupting once, nodding slowly at parts of it, the way a man nods when he's realizing he's been wrong about something for longer than he'd like to admit. When Wyatt finished, Dewey asked if the boy would help him rig something similar before next spring. Wyatt said he would, and meant it. Word spread slowly after that, the way it does in a small hollow where everyone eventually hears everything. Denise Coyle came back out in August, not for the orchard this time but specifically to see Wyatt's system, walking the setup with a genuine curiosity that surprised even Roy. She took photographs, asked detailed questions about flow rates and seal materials, and mentioned that she might bring it up at the next extension office meeting as an example worth sharing with other struggling farms in the county. Wyatt felt a flush of something like pride he didn't quite know what to do with. The naturalist Aldo Leopold once wrote that there are some who can live without wild things, and some who cannot. Wyatt Teller learned something close to the opposite lesson that spring and summer, that there are some who can live without paying attention to what's right in front of them, and some who simply cannot help but notice. The rain had always fallen on that barn roof. It had fallen there for 3 generations of Tellers before him, running off into the creek and disappearing, unclaimed and unquestioned. Nobody had ever thought to ask where it went until a 12-year-old boy did. The harvest that year wasn't really about the orchard, though the orchard did fine, better than fine, considering the drought that had scorched half the county around it. The apples came in heavy that September, the branches bending low with fruit while neighboring orchards produced barely a third of their usual yield. The real harvest was quieter than that, though. It was a boy who watched water instead of waiting for it to fall from somewhere else. It was a grandfather's notebook, 50 years of rainfall totals nobody thought to use until someone finally did. It was the discipline of failing twice, resealing, waiting the full week without testing, and trying again without complaint. It was also, in its own quiet way, a family learning something about one of its own. Roy had spent the whole spring watching his son from a careful distance, neither encouraging nor discouraging, the way he'd been raised to handle most things. By August, he'd stopped standing at a distance. He and Wyatt spent whole evenings now sketching out plans for a larger system, one that might eventually water the lower fields too, Roy contributing what he knew about pipe pressure and Wyatt contributing what he'd learned from months of trial and error. Carol, for her part, had started keeping her own small log of water levels in the cistern, adding it almost without thinking to the same ledger where she tracked chicken feed and egg sales, as though the rain barrels had simply become another part of the farm's accounting. Wyatt is 13 now. He's already planning a 3rd collection system off the house roof, sitting most evenings with Ellis at the kitchen table, working out the numbers from the old notebook together, one generation's memory feeding directly into the next one's plans. The two of them make an odd pair bent over the same yellowed pages, separated by nearly 70 years but speaking the same quiet language of numbers and inches and patience. Dewey Hargrove has his own barrels lined up behind his barn, waiting on spring, with Wyatt's help promised for the trenching, and he's already told 2 other farmers on his road about the boy who figured out what nobody else had bothered to. Josephine still doesn't fully understand what her brother built, but she stopped teasing him about it sometime in July, right around the time the rest of the county started asking questions too. She mentioned it once, almost offhand, to her boyfriend, describing it with a note of something that might have been pride, though she'd never admit it outright. And the rain that used to run off Miller's Hollow and disappear into the creek is, more and more, staying right where it's needed, not because the weather changed, but because someone finally started paying attention to it. The barrels behind the Teller barn have multiplied since that first spring, and the cistern Wyatt built with a cracked stock tank and roofing tar still holds water without a single leak, exactly as it has since the day he finally let it cure the way his grandfather told him to. What's a piece of overlooked wisdom that stuck with you from someone in your family? Tell us in the comments, we read every one. And if stories like this one matter to you, subscribe. We'd love to have you along.